Hello and welcome. I'm Tracy Carr from the Mississippi Library Commission, and welcome to Table Topics, our humanities lecture series. Today we're going to hear Behind Every Good Man is a Civil Rights Heroine with Dr. Rebecca Turi. Just a few things. Well, first of all, these talks are sponsored by the Mississippi Humanities Council, and this lecture is co-hosted by the Library of Hattiesburg, Petal, and Forest County. So if you, let me admit all the people in the room. If you will mute yourselves and hold your questions to the end, but please, if you have a question, please put it in the chat so you won't forget it. At the end, after Dr. Tuuri is done, we'll loop back to those questions and she'll answer all of them, I'm sure, in lots of detail, and it'll be great. And if you're watching this on Facebook, please do the same thing. Put your questions in the comments, and through the magic of technology, someone will text me with those questions and we'll get them answered. Let's see, Sean, did you want to promote the other things in your series?
Absolutely. We're so grateful that Tracy invited us to be part of this. See a lot of folks that I know in the participants. We've been Zooming humanities lectures since the pandemic. So many of you who are there know that on May 21st, we have our next one on the presidency of U.S. Grant. But those of you who are sort of more the table talk MLC attendees, please go to our Facebook at hatlibrary.org, navigate to our Facebook page, and you'll get the ability to find out about our upcoming U.S. Grant lecture, and then I'll have you on my email list forever, so you'll know about all our upcoming humanities lectures. Again, thank you so much, Tracy, for allowing us to be a part of this, and preemptively, thank you, Rebecca. I know you're going to do a good job because you always do.
Okay. I'm going to introduce Dr. Tuuri, and then we'll hand it over to her. Dr. Rebecca Turi is an associate professor of history at the University of Southern Mississippi, where she teaches civil rights, African American, women's, and gender and world history. She has recently published Strategic Sisterhood, the National Council of Negro Women in the Black Freedom Struggle, which won the 2019 prize for Best Book in Southern Women's History from the Southern Association of Women Historians. She is the winner of a 2021 Mississippi Humanities Council Teacher of the Year Award, the 2019 USM College of Arts and Sciences Junior Faculty of the Year, and a 2016 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend Award. She currently serves on the boards of the Gulf South Historical Association, the Mississippi Historical Society, and is co-director for the Center for the Study of the Gulf South at Southern Miss. So welcome, Dr. Tuuri, and I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, I'm first going to share my screen here to make sure I don't forget that part. Okay. All right, well, greetings. Thank you so much to Library Services Director Tracy Carr for inviting me this afternoon to speak to the Mississippi Library Commission's Table Topics Virtual Lecture Series. Thank you also to Sean and the Hattiesburg Public Library for your sponsorship. Thank you also to you all in the audience for being with me here today, for Zooming in. It's quite nice to have you here with me today. And as Tracy said before, my title of my talk is Behind Every Good Man is a Civil Rights Heroine. And so I begin today by asking a question. I can't get responses from you, so it's sort of rhetorical. But when I want you to think about the civil rights movement, and when I say the civil rights movement, what iconic people, places, or events might come to your mind? So perhaps you thought of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, or the Montgomery bus boycott. But there is perhaps no moment more iconic for the civil rights movement than this one. On August 28th, 1963, in Washington, D.C., there was the March on Washington. And on that historic day, 250,000 people heard from some of the main leaders of the civil rights movement, including the Big Six leaders: A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Martin Luther King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality, Whitney Young of the Urban League, and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. All of those men headed the largest civil rights organizations at the time. And although there were many people who spoke that day, most people really think only Martin Luther King is the one who gave his "I Had to Have a Dream" speech. But there were many other speeches on that day. In fact, that march, hopefully you know this, but just in case you don't, that march was actually titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So, and it was organized by the largest Black union at the time, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And so that march had a much larger purpose in trying to promote economic gains for African Americans. But I'm going to now show you an image of the schedule for the March on Washington, so you guys can see the schedule from that particular day. And I want you to kind of look over it and try to see who spoke on that day and what else you might notice. Take a moment, look over that. And so hopefully you can see this, but many female leaders had urged male leadership to include a woman as one of the main speakers for that day. But no woman leader was actually permitted to give one of the major speeches. The compromise that was agreed to shortly before the event was that Daisy Bates, that originally it was supposed to be Myrlie Evers, Mrs. Medgar Evers, who would give a speech, a short series of remarks on behalf of the women in the movement. And you can see that they were going to be honoring multiple women all at once here with this tribute to Negro women fighters for freedom. But Myrlie Evers was unable to be there that day. And so Daisy Bates actually was the one who stood up and delivered this short tribute on behalf of all women of the movement. And so the other women voices that were heard on that day were singers. As you can see, Mahalia Jackson was one of the people to sing on that day, but no woman was invited to give one of the major speeches of that day. Paulie Murray, an outspoken Black feminist lawyer who later became the nation's first Black female Episcopalian priest, later criticized the male leadership for pushing women into the background and giving them no more than ornamental status at this event and within the movement more broadly. Yet women had been a major part of the movement from the time of its founding, and they actually comprised the majority of participants and local organizers of the movement. They just were not the visible formal leaders. In fact, if we look at a closer view of the platform on the day of the March on Washington, we can actually see some of those women leaders. So now I'm going to show, this is from the actual platform, and you see Martin Luther King there getting ready to deliver his speech. And right here, in dead smack in the middle, like there she is in her beautiful hat, Dorothy Height, head of the largest Black women's organization at the time, the National Council of Negro Women, which was actually founded by Mary Mccloud Bethune in 1935. Dorothy Height is there only a few feet away from Martin Luther King. She was not invited to give a speech that day. You can also see part of Coretta Scott King's face. You can see Mahalia Jackson there as well. With so women are there. Many scholars have called women, the people who worked behind the scenes of the movement, who showed up in greater numbers to church rallies, protests, marches, and boycotts, the foot soldiers of the movement. Long before the so-called second wave feminist movement began, Black women across the country were fighting for political power, fighting for better jobs and training for Black women, fighting for better childcare and schools and food for themselves and their families, and fighting against young women's sexual abuse. In short, Black women in the civil rights movement fought to make their standard of living better, not just through the vote, not just through desegregation of schools and facilities, but through access to better resources. Now, while there were all women's clubs, such as the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the NCNW, that again was headed by Height, and there were sororities and business organizations targeting Black women, women chose typically to get involved in the civil rights movement more through mixed sex groups like the NAACP. But within these male-led groups, women had a hard time rising in the ranks, but they still had a tremendous impact. Women were very often the youth leaders within the NAACP, where they could influence the next generation of activists to become more involved in the Black freedom struggle. One such leader from Mississippi was Vera Piggy, who ran the student chapter of the NAACP in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Now, the picture on the left shows Peggy in her beauty salon. She was a beauty shop owner. And the one on the right shows her teaching a citizenship class to adult students. Peggy helped to insist on change for African Americans long before and after the well-known civil rights events in Mississippi. And historian Francois Hamlin has argued that Peggy is as important to the movement as Clarksdale NAACP leader Aaron Henry, who was a much more visible leader in multiple movements in Mississippi. But Peggy, unlike Aaron Henry, has never received the recognition she deserves for the time that she put into the movement in Clarksdale. Now, interestingly, I want to go back to this image of Peggy to dwell a little bit on her profession. And as you can see here, she's a beautician. That was her source of living. And many women in the civil rights movement owned beauty salons. Why? Because they were independent business owners. Their clientele were Black women, and so they were not under sort of the thumb of white control. Unlike teachers and administrators in the public school system, independent business owners, especially beauty salon owners, had independence to become involved in the movement. They could not be economically threatened in the same way other groups could. And the citizenship school in this image was actually in the back of her beauty salon. So I wanted to kind of point this out because, again, beauty shop owners played a huge role in the civil rights movement, especially in places like Mississippi. And I'm going to talk about a few other beauty salon owners just today, 2 others. Perhaps no other organization besides the NAACP was as important to the civil rights movement in Mississippi as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was founded in 1960 under the guidance of this woman, Ella Baker. Now, Ella Baker was a leader within the NAACP and the SCLC, but she could never rise to a prominent national and permanent position in either of those organizations. Why? Well, as she put it, she was neither a man nor a minister. And so Baker was very cognizant of kind of some of the limitations that she was up against within the civil rights movement. But some scholars believe that part of the reason that the experiences of discrimination that Ella Baker faced helped her to really hone her concept of something called participatory democracy, or that idea that was so crucial to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that all people should take part in and lead movements for their own freedom. As Ella Baker said, strong people don't need strong leaders. And again, you know, she had had these experiences in these more formal organizations that were male-led, the NAACP and the SCLC. And when it was time for students around the country who were engaging in these sit-ins in the 1960s, Ella Baker helped bring together those students to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she really wanted to push them against that idea that they needed a formal leadership structure in SNCC. And it was that philosophy of SNCC that the people under the heel, the poorest of the poor, should be the ones to fight oppression that made such a profound impact in Mississippi, and made a profound impact on young people, on poor people, and especially women in the fight for their own rights. Now, Hattiesburg area resident Victoria Jackson Gray was actually setting out to be the most successful businesswoman in town when that very organization, SNCC, caught her attention in 1962. Victoria Jackson Gray had grown up in Palmer's Crossing, which is south of Hattiesburg, and then attended Wilberforce University in Ohio, and then returned to Mississippi to marry Anthony Gray. She and her husband then lived in Germany during the Korean War for a little bit of time, and then they returned to Palmer's Crossing, where she again tried to establish her successful beauty business. So there we go, there's another beauty shop owner. In the spring of 1962, Victoria Jackson Gray encouraged her pastor, Reverend L.P. Ponder of St. John's Methodist Church in Palmer's Crossing, again, just a few miles south of Hattiesburg, to open up his sanctuary to two young SNCC activists, Curtis Hayes and Hollis Watkins, who were trying to establish a voter registration project in the area. After she encouraged Reverend Ponder to open his church to SNCC activists, she also went to try to register to vote in Hattiesburg. And when she tried to register to vote, she was met by the notoriously obstinate Theron Lind, who was the registrar at the time. And Lind had allowed no Black people to vote in his 2 years as registrar, from 1960 to 1962. And when Black Hattiesburg residents tried to register to vote, Lind gave them impossible literacy test questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And while in Hattiesburg, with the help of Gray, these two young SNCC activists, Curtis Hayes and Hollis Watkins, built up the strength of local voter registration. And although only 4 of the 150 Black Hattiesburg citizens who tried to register to vote in that first year of SNCC's arrival were actually successful, and really only because the Justice Department pressured Lind into accepting those 4 applicants. Those failed efforts then helped to boost evidence of discrimination and a national attention onto Hattiesburg. And those instances of voter discrimination were very important in helping to give evidence for the need for a Voting Rights Act in 1965. When Curtis Hayes and Hollis Watkins moved on to organize projects in other parts of the country, Victoria Jackson Gray became the leader of the newly created Forest County Voters League. And she canvassed and attended workshops. She held citizenship training classes that taught basic literacy and also citizenship lessons about how to try to register to vote. And she generally kept the movement going in Hattiesburg. Meanwhile, in other parts of Mississippi, the movement, especially led by SNCC, was strengthening with significant participation and leadership and support from women workers. In 1962, SNCC joined forces with the Congress of Racial Equality, another long-established civil rights organization, and the Mississippi NAACP to officially bring together different civil rights groups to create the umbrella organization known as the Council of Federated Organizations, or COFO. And that happened in 1962. Now, one of the first major things that COFO sponsored was the freedom vote. Whites in Mississippi had long argued that their discriminatory Jim Crow era voter laws did not matter because Blacks did not want to vote in the state. And so to combat this lie, COFO created a mock election called the Freedom Vote during the gubernatorial election in fall of 1963. And 83,000 Black Mississippians who had been denied the right to safely register to vote came out to cast their ballot for the freedom ticket, with Aaron Henry, again, Aaron Henry of Clarksdale, as the gubernatorial candidate and Ed King as the lieutenant governor. And after witnessing such a tremendous turnout, the COFO conglomerate created a new political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the following spring to be a new party to open up the Democratic Party to people of all races in order to rival the lily white Democratic Party in Mississippi. As historian Vicki Crawford has pointed out, from its very beginning, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party encouraged Black women's political power in a way that no other organization had done so before. And women and men joined and participated in this organization in equal numbers. And women ran for office and became the formal leaders of this organization from the very beginning of its founding. Victoria Jackson Gray became the first Black woman in Mississippi to run for Senate in June of 1964, when she ran against Senator John Stennis in the Democratic primary. And so I want to just pause and say again, she was the first Black woman to run for Senate, and she did so in June of 1964 against the very powerful Senator Stennis. And this is a commonly misunderstood point because she later ran again for US Congress as an independent, but she first ran for Senate in late spring. John Earl Cameron, also of Hattiesburg, ran against William Culmer in the 5th District in that primary election. Fannie Lou Hamer became the first Black woman from Mississippi to run for a US Congress seat when she ran against Jamie Whitten in the 2nd District, and James Houston of Vicksburg ran against John Bell Williams in the 3rd District in the Democratic primary, 4 seats in the US House of Representatives. But unsurprisingly, all of these candidates lost their bid for the Democratic nomination in 1964. But they wanted their efforts to go on record to show how these failed runs, showed evidence of discrimination, both in voting and also in an effort to run for Congress. And Victoria Jackson Gray emphasized how important her run for the Senate was to spread democracy to all people in America and to really give people in Mississippi, Black people in Mississippi, to show them that anybody could run for Congress. And so I'm going to actually stop and play a clip from an excerpt of an interview that Gray conducted in 1999 with former USM professor Charles Bolton. He was also the former director of the Center for Oral History and Cultural Heritage here at Southern Miss. And this interview comes from our very rich collection. If you don't know about it, look it up. It's great. We have 4,000 interviews. But here in this particular clip, she describes the profound impact that her run as a woman and as a Black woman had on the willingness of locals to then at least just try to go register to vote, or maybe even run for office themselves. So we're going to stop. I'm going to make sure that the sound is ready. Okay, here we go.
I ran for Congress. Right. That was, for me, that was one of the most.
Okay, sorry, I think I messed that up. Let me start that over.
I ran for Congress. Right. That was, for me, that was one of the most beautiful educational events that we did, because we went then from the mock ballot to the ballot.
To the real ballot. Yes.
And people, for many people, I'm quite certain this was the first time that they realized that, oh, we are qualified, or we can qualify. We can do this, you know? So for those, particularly for those who said, well, why should I risk whatever it is that they had to risk to go down there, ain't nobody to vote for? Who are you going to vote for, But when I get on the ballot, you got somebody to vote for. And so the point is, of course, yes, you can. You have a right to be there. You can be there. You can put your own candidates up there. You can put yourself up there. So I thought that was what you call OJT. That was very impacting for many people. I think that freedom up, that gave them what they needed to go ahead and take the chance.
Women's leadership came to the foreground again a little over 2 months later, as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party traveled to the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. The MFDP sent 68 delegates to the convention to replace the regularly elected all-white Democratic delegates from Mississippi. Now, MFDP claimed that because it was an integrated group open to people of all races, that it should be the delegation recognized by the Democratic National Convention. As part of their effort to unseat the regulars, the MFDP first had to make its case before the Credentials Committee of the convention. There, Fannie Lou Hamer, the same woman who had just run in the Democratic primary along with Victoria Jackson Gray, delivered an 8-minute speech detailing her arduous civil rights work. Fannie Lou Hamer, a woman from Ruleville, Mississippi, captured the hearts and minds of Americans across the country during the convention with her incredible voice, presence, and compelling personal story when she testified on television before that Credentials Committee and described the violence that she and other activists had faced while trying to register to vote. Hamer had grown up in the Deep South, in Ruleville and Sunflower County in the Delta. She began to pick cotton at age 6. She had been a sharecropper for 18 years when she lost her job and was kicked out of her home after her boss found out that she had tried to register to vote. She was imprisoned for her civil rights work and was both beaten and sexually assaulted in jail. And her outspoken wisdom became inspirational to many different students and activists who came down to Mississippi in the civil rights movement. And lots of people in Mississippi were also inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer. So I'm actually going to play for you 3 clips from that short speech from Hamer to the Credentials Committee, where she tried to make the case for why the MFDP delegates should be seated.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stinnett.
Okay, so there in that first clip, we heard Hamer introduce herself and point to the profound difference between sharecroppers like herself and the Mississippi senators from the Delta who held so much power in the Senate at that time. She then went on to describe her effort to register to vote in 1962 and the harassment and violence that followed. In this next clip, you're going to hear her talk about what happened to her right after trying to register to vote when she came home to the plantation.
I was met there by my children that told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I mean that if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. That then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we're not ready for that in Mississippi. And I addressed him and told him that I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself.
So as you can hear there, she has such a powerful voice and presence. And there's a communication studies professor named Megan Parker Brooks who's worked with Jackson State to put many of Fannie Lou Hamer's speeches online. So if you're interested in that, I can help you get in touch with, I can help you find those speeches. They are incredibly powerful. She's a wonderful orator. She was kicked off the plantation that same night that she tried to register to vote and lost her livelihood and her home in the process. She then went on in this very short speech to describe the brutal beating she received after returning from a voter registration workshop in 1963. And she was actually in jail when Medgar Evers was assassinated. But I want to play for you the very final part of this speech, and because it is itself so powerful.
All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Though other male civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King and Aaron Henry, spoke on that day, it was Hamer, with her tremendous speech, who is most remembered from this challenge. As Bob Moses has stated in a recent documentary, Mrs. Hamer had Mississippi in her bones. Hamer, a sharecropper since the age of 6, was the MFDP representative whose message most intimidated President Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson called an impromptu press conference to take the cameras off of Hamer during the speech, but his attempt backfired as the media recognized what had happened and then replayed Hamer's full testimony over and over on the air later. Despite the compelling pleas of the MFDP to replace the regular Democrats, the Democratic National Committee only offered 2 at-large seats to MFDP leaders Aaron Henry, who was the chairman of the MFDP delegation, and Ed King, the national committeeman for the delegation. Now, Victoria Jackson Gray from Hattiesburg served as national committee woman, and Hamer served as vice chairman, and another woman, Canton civil rights activist Annie Devine, served as secretary of the delegation, and they were the 5 official leaders of that challenge. But notably, the Democratic National Convention only offered those seats to the 2 men of the 5 leaders. Well, Hamer, Gray, and Devine led the charge against the compromise, claiming we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. As John Dittmer, historian John Dittmer, points out in his classic work, Local People, a young MFDP member named Henry Sias tried to argue that the group should accept Johnson's compromise of 2 at-large seats because he thought, well, taking something is better than nothing. And Dittmer quoted Sias as saying that Hamer and Devine, quote, hit the ceiling, hooping and hollering and telling me what a shame it was for me to do that. And Sias then said, he, quote, hushed right then. I changed my mind right there. Those 2 women just shamed me right there. And so the 3 women leaders of that challenge, Gray, Hamer, and Devine, were pivotal members of the MFDP Atlantic City Challenge. But they also continued their activism after the party returned. And this is the part lots of historians just sort of forget, that this party continued to do lots of things in Mississippi after it returned. And with great resolve, those 3 women all ran for U.S. Congress as independents in that fall. They found the necessary signatures to qualify as independent candidates and then petitioned the Secretary of State to be included on the November ballot. But they were told that each signature had to be verified by the local circuit court, and that effectively killed their challenge, as the county registrars would not find those signatures legitimate. Most of the people who would sign were going to be Black and probably not registered to vote. So because these women were not given the opportunity to be on the November ballot, they then went on to challenge the legitimacy of the election itself and the legitimacy of seating the state's 5 representatives in January of 1965. They argued that the election of the Mississippi congressman was actually illegal, since only 6% of Black people in Mississippi were allowed to vote in the state because of poll taxes and understanding clauses. While the women did not immediately win their challenge in January of 1965, they were given a few months to collect evidence of voter discrimination that would then go in front of the House. The MFDP then collected over 600 depositions of people in Mississippi, and that totaled 15,000 pages of evidence of voter discrimination. And while the women did ultimately lose their, sorry, the audio just got me. While the women did ultimately lose their challenge to try to unseat the congressman from Mississippi, those 15,000 pages were just further evidence to help kind of support the need for a Voting Rights Act and support the need for federal intervention in voting. Still, while a watershed moment, the benefits of the Voting Rights Act were slow to reach Mississippi. And while Black women could now vote, they were not yet able to be elected in the state. The Mississippi legislature quickly drew up voting district lines to dilute the Black vote and ensure that Black political representation remained unlikely. But Black women once again persisted. It took the courage and persistence of Mrs. Peggy Jean Connor, and she's here in the center of this image, a founder and eventual executive director of MFDP, to open up Black representation in the state. Peggy Jean Connor was the daughter of parents who had previously been able to vote in the 1930s and 40s in Hattiesburg, and her parents had been committed to fighting for civil rights in the area. She herself picked up that same spirit and exhibited a calm yet proud resolve, and had helped Mrs. Victoria Jackson Gray with voter registration from the very beginning of Gray's work in Hattiesburg. Connor was also a beautician, and here we see an image, if you can kind of see under the shoe shine on the image, I guess on the right. Under there, you see something that says Jean's Beauty, and it was said Jean's Beauty Salon, and that is actually the sign for Peggy Jean Connor's beauty salon. She became a beautician at age 14 and owned her own shop at the age of 21 and held citizenships classes in Hattiesburg in her shop. In October of 1965, only a few weeks after the final resolution of Hamer, Devine, and Gray's congressional challenge, Peggy Jean Connor lent her name to a new court case, along with 7 other plaintiffs who were part of the MFDP, to challenge the way in which Mississippi legislative districts were drawn up. For 14 years, her court case went through a series of decisions and appeals until by 1979, the Supreme Court argued that in being fair to all constituents, Mississippi had to create legislative districts in which Black candidates had a reasonable chance of being elected. And after the end of this 14-year battle, the number of Black elected officials in the state skyrocketed. In the 1979 election, 17 African Americans were elected to the state legislature in Mississippi. And the US Supreme Court began to now factor race as well as population when deciding on the legality of legislative districts. So we can see the many ways in which Black women from Mississippi were national leaders in desegregation and voter registration campaigns, but many others were not nearly as visible and lent their efforts behind the scenes. Ohio State professor T.E. Morris has examined an organization of Black women in Jackson who supported the movement from behind the scenes. In 1961, when Freedom Riders were arrested in Jackson and then sent to Parchman Prison, Women Power Unlimited was formed as an organization to procure blankets, clothing, toiletries, shower shoes, magazines, and other items for imprisoned activists. After the activists were released from Parchman, Women Power Unlimited members helped organize places for activists to sleep, shower, and eat. And they continued their activities long after 1961. And they helped with Freedom Summer and Head Start in later years. These women engaged in something that sociologist Nancy Naples identifies as activist mothering. And this was the effort of Black women who cared not only for their own families, but for activists and the community more broadly. And some of these women had no biological children, but still envisioned themselves as mothers of the movement. And they felt they had a responsibility to care for the youth activists of the movement. This also draws on a long tradition of African-American women who were other mothers, a term coined by Patricia Hill Collins in her book, Black Feminist Thought, which argues that that women, besides blood mothers, play a crucial role in raising children and communities. And this other mothering was influenced by African women-centered networks of support and the experience of oppression, first through slavery and then Jim Crow and the legacies of inequality that African-American women had to go through. And finally, one additional scholar I do want to mention here is Belinda Robnett, who's actually a sociologist, who identified that Black women activists of the civil rights movement were something called bridge leaders, or women who provided a crucial link between the outside activists of national organizations and the local civil rights people on the ground who would get things done. And it was only through the collaborative effort of those bridge leaders that the movement succeeded. And then the final thing I do want to kind of point out about women in the civil rights movement was the important role that young women played as the ones to integrate schools. In the same year that Clyde Kennard tried to integrate my institution, the University of Southern Mississippi, then called Mississippi Southern College, Autherine Lucy became the first African American to try to integrate the University of Alabama. If we look at what the Little Rock Nine of 1957, who tried to integrate Central High School, looks like of the 9 students, only 3 were men while 6 were young women. And the leader of that movement, again, who oversaw the youth activities, was Daisy Bates, who was the statewide leader of the NAACP at that point. And who could forget Norman Rockwell's iconic image of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges integrating the public schools in New Orleans. And in my institution, the 2 African Americans who were the first to actually enter Southern Miss in the fall of 1965 were Gwendolyn Elaine Armstrong and Raylani Branch, 2 women. So why is it that the leaders and the foot soldiers are women, while most people think of somebody like Martin Luther King as the leader of the movement? Well, that's another picture of Branch and Armstrong there. This image tells us a lot here. And you can see here that this is an image of the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike, the strike in which Martin Luther King went to support when he was assassinated. And here you see, though, the slogan of that sanitation workers strike, "I am a man." And you might wonder, well, why was that strategy of all strategies utilized? But we have to think historically. So long, Black men had been denied the opportunities available to white men. And many men and women and Black women framed the civil rights movement as the time for Black men to rise to leadership roles. In fact, Dorothy Height, the same woman that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, was the president of the NCNW, the largest Black women's organization at the time. But she was actually quoted in the Moynihan report saying that if there was one thing that Black women were concerned about, it was the status of Black men. So Black women were trying to support Black men. They were fighting against stereotypes that labeled them as domineering and controlling. And so in this environment, many Black women thought that they could be more effective and more supportive of the movement as a whole behind the scenes. And our public memory in many ways reflects that. Here is the image, the only image on the National Mall devoted to civil rights. And there you see it. Martin Luther King, very clearly, very, in a very strong manner, is up there as the only statue to the civil rights movement. But if you look closer in Washington, D.C., you will find a statue that preceded this by a few decades. And that is actually this statue of Mary Mccloud Bethune. She was the founder of the NCNW, and this statue went up in 1974. This statue went up with the very long-term, 16-year-long effort of the NCNW to raise private funds to put up a statue to their beloved founder. And this is the first statue to an African American on public land in Washington, D.C. It's in Lincoln Park, and it was put up very deliberately in Lincoln Park because there's this statue of President Lincoln that was put up in 1876, and it shows Lincoln kind of looking over a kneeling slave. And while many African American activists in 1876 were thrilled to see something to Lincoln, they were not thrilled to see the subservient position of the enslaved man in this statue. And so that was why the NCNW chose to put a statue to their beloved founder, Mary Mccloud Bethune, who of course was also the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, and also a politician who worked for several presidents. So they wanted to put Bethune there to stand in opposition. But in order to get Bethune in that wonderful park that faces the Capitol, they wanted Bethune to be able to face the Capitol. But that would mean that Lincoln was going to have his back turned to Bethune. So the NCNW was able to get the Park Service to turn Lincoln's statue around so that he would have to face Mary Mccloud Bethune, and Mary Mccloud Bethune is the one who has the honor of looking at the Capitol building. So I'd like to end my talk today by showing you this statue. We'll go back to the Bethune statue, because it shows that the women of the NCNW and women of other organizations that were male-led, such as the NAACP and the SCLC, have always been there. You just have to know where to look. So thank you so much for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Turi. That was really interesting, and I think I speak for everyone when there are photos and sound. It just brings history to life. And as a librarian, I always appreciate a good primary source document. So yes, all right. So I'm going to recap some of the stuff that was going on in the chat.
Okay. Yes, I did not see. I'm sorry, chat was not on my radar.
That's fine. In the photo, the March on Washington photo, where you can see people.
I'll go back to it and then I'll share it.
There were some comments, that's possible it was me, remarking on Mahalia Jackson's awesome hat. But also in that photo, Sammy Davis Jr. is over in the bottom right corner.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So he was spotted, and I was excited about that. But yes, you know, not only do you, it seems sort of frivolous to comment on people's clothes when they are at this, you know, momentous thing, but these women are dressed for a reason. So I think it is okay to appreciate.
It is very important to notice what they're wearing. It's very deliberate. I mean, because women like Dorothy Height had to always go above and beyond because they were fighting against such horrible stereotypes that existed at that time. And so Dorothy Height was always incredibly careful to present herself in the most respectable way possible, the most ladylike fashion you could imagine. And so it is important to notice those things, you know. So I'm glad you're pointing that out. The hats.
I mean,
and the
I wasn't
pearls.
thinking. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of the importance. I was just like, wow, cool hat. But if there's something behind wow, cool hat, I'll take it. Let's see. Someone said that LBJ scheduled a press conference during Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony to keep her from being seen and heard.
Yes, yes. Now I've heard I've seen one oral interview where somebody says, well, he already had it scheduled in case he needed to use it. And so it was sort of a minor thing, and I forget the exact thing. I think people thought he might be announcing who his vice presidential candidate would be, but it was the 3/4 anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, I think is what it was. But it was sort of this very obscure thing, and so people were sort of like all the press people who had moved away from Fannie Lou Hamer's remarks to this kind of press conference were scratching their heads. So it wasn't as successful as maybe LBJ had wanted it to be. But yeah, he was intimidated by her. She was, and and that was part of the challenge with someone like Johnson, was that he wanted the movement on his terms, right? And he got really angry when it wasn't on his terms. And people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who were grassroots folks in Mississippi, wanted to define the terms. And the MFDP was an organization that included people like Hamer. It wasn't just Hamer, but it included and gave a space for Hamer. And Johnson just thought that was very misguided.
In the photo of, it's several women.
Probably Women Power Unlimited. Let me see. I'll
yes.
go.
Yes. Someone said, I believe that is Mrs. Thelma Sanders, second from left.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the audio. I'm not. Yes.
Owner
here
of Sanders Dress Shop on Jackson's Farish Street and wife of Dr. I.S. Sanders, for whom a library was named in Jackson.
That is correct. That is correct. And she, yeah, did you say that she had a dress shop?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, you see, and Woman Power Unlimited, again, look at how beautiful all of these women are. They are also incredibly careful to present themselves always in a certain fashion. And she had a dress shop for ladies. And part of the reason was that she wanted everyone to have a space available to them to try on hats and try on clothing, because they were denied that privilege or right in Jackson at the time. So yes, and then next to her, of course, is Clary Collins Harvey of the Collins Funeral Home too. So this was a Jackson-based organization. And if you haven't already read the book, I highly recommend T.E. Morris's Woman Power Unlimited book. It's fantastic. And if you have more information about any of these women, please let me know. I would love to know more. So.
In response to your explanation about answering your main question, why is the focus on men, and when these women are doing all this incredible work? Someone commented, that's exactly true, Dr. Turi. Thank you so much for bringing that out. The struggle and tension of Black women staying in the shadows so Black men would be prominent is a painful but necessary, at the time, they thought, legacy of the movement. Another excellent presentation, Dr. Turi. So you have some fan mail in the comments too.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I mean, I want to just illuminate some of the struggles that Black women were facing, but by no means do I say that this was the wrong strategy. There was, Black women prioritized the race, to be quite honest, because they had experienced so much racism from white women in Mississippi. They had honestly very little reason to expect that white women in Mississippi would support them. I mean, I can count on my hands how many white women in Mississippi I found in my research who were openly supportive of the movement. There were some people behind the scenes, but it was hard work. And Black women wanted to put their energy and efforts towards supporting the race and the benefit to move the civil rights movement forward. And Dorothy Height even talks a little bit about that in some of the oral interviews that she did and her Open Wide the Freedom Gates memoir that she wrote. And so if you're interested in learning more about Dorothy Height or the NCNW, please do look at her memoir. Yeah.
There's another comment about how hats are very important. U.S. Representative Alma Adams always had a hat, huge collection, and she fought to wear hats in Congress, which previously was not permitted. That's an interesting fact. Here's a question. I believe Fannie Lou Hamer gave her actual address when speaking to the Credentials Committee. Was there safety concerns or ramifications of giving volatile opposition that kind of information? I thought of the same thing. I was like, oh no, she gave her real address.
That was very deliberate on her part, because they already knew where she lived, and in some ways it kind of acknowledged that there was nothing else they could do. Like, she was going to just put it out there, but they already knew where she was. And when she went to register to vote, she went to stay in someone else's home after getting kicked off of the plantation that she lived on. And some people went, some angry white people went and tried to shoot into the house that they thought that she was staying at. So it was very dangerous to be an activist, and it was very dangerous for Fannie Lou Hamer. But I think she wanted to make clear that, you know, I'm going to put everything out there and tell you where I live. And also, I think she wanted to really emphasize the huge disparity between her and the rich people of the Delta, including even some elected officials. And so, you know, I think she was really trying to emphasize her location as a means to show even more clearly the injustices that existed along racial lines in Mississippi. And there's another good book for that too, called The Senator and the Sharecropper. If you want to know, I mean, one of the wonderful things about Mississippi is that we have such a rich history of civil rights and such a profound and impressive history of Black women and Black men fighting for justice. Like, this is, you know, these are heroes, national heroes who are from Mississippi that a lot of historians are interested in. So.
And speaking of, you know, Black women empowering and leading movements, there was a question about, you know, like Stacey Abrams coming to be such a huge motivating presence in election integrity. Although, can you talk more about like how, if that's a trend or how that's going?
Well, first I have to tell you that Stacey Abrams' parents are from Hattiesburg and were, you know, active in the late 60s civil rights movement, both of her parents. And her mom was valedictorian of the last all-Black class of the all-Black high school in Hattiesburg. So she comes from a very proud tradition of Black resistance from the Deep South. So I'm not all that surprised in many ways, because she has models of people, and her mother's just a phenomenal woman in her own right. I think Stacey Abrams is sort of continuing the movements that people like the women of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party began. And there have been women in the interim from the 60s through, you know, in that kind of 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s period, you know, being active. But right now we're seeing such a momentum, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, that I think that you know, Stacey Abrams is able to kind of also pull on that. But you will see too that there's a huge pushback against her and her efforts to try to get more people registered to vote. You see this kind of the legal efforts to restrict voting and to make it harder for minority and elderly voters to vote. So it's not easy, and it will be fought, and it will be fought legally, right? In these ways that seem to be by the books, but you can see that the intention is to slow down or stop certain kinds of voters. And so I applaud what Stacey Abrams is trying to do. I mean, I think in Mississippi, we are ripe for another kind of movement to build up the vote. And I know there are different initiatives that already have been going on for quite some time, but hopefully there'll be enough kind of momentum now to get lots of people interested in those efforts to open up the vote. But Stacey Abrams comes from, like, there's a longer history of not just oppression from Mississippi, which is clearly there and is definitely there, and Stacey Abrams's family even has examples of that. But also there's like that spirit and fire of resistance that has been there too. And so I think we've got a lot of people in Mississippi who have that legacy, who are part of that. And we need to sort of tap back into that so that we can have this sort of similar movement here in our state, I think.
Well, what you were just saying about Stacey Abrams and representation reminded me of what Victoria Jackson Gray was saying about, you know, when people were saying, like, well, who am I even going to vote for? Why would I risk my life for this? And by getting on the ballot, she showed people that this is what we can do. This is why you need to vote, because we can run for office and do whatever.
Yes, but expect resistance as that happens, right? I think that's the second part of it, is that as people become empowered and gain more power, there will be pushback, and expect that. At least from a historical stance, that's pretty normal. So, so that is one of the other battles you'll have, people will have to fight, and it's not always easy to fight for equality. It can even be dangerous when you do that. So.
Well, Dr. Turi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for answering everyone's questions, and especially for having so many, visual and auditory things for us to learn from as well. So we thank you for being a part of this.
Well, I thank you guys so much. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about the history, the civil rights history that we have in our state. So if you have any further questions too, Tracy, can you share my information with anybody who might want to just follow up? But you can also just sort of Google me. I'm at the University of Southern Mississippi, and I teach civil rights. I'm in the history program, so you should be able to find me too. So, okay, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks everyone who came, and have a great day. We'll see you again. Our next talk is on June 4th, and it's going to be about Margaret and H.A. Ray, a partnership that created an icon. It's about Curious George. So we'll see you there for that. And everyone, again, thanks for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.